The airline captain stood blocking the jetway, arms crossed, refusing to let Dr. Ada Mitchell board Flight 447 to Houston. Her worn sneakers and casual jacket didn't match his idea of a first-class passenger. But when security forced open her wallet, the NASA aerospace engineer credentials inside would trigger a chain of events that would cost him everything he'd built in 20 years of flying. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look, hit that like button right now. And subscribe so you never miss stories of courage standing up to injustice. Now, let's see how one moment of discrimination set off a chain reaction that would shake an entire industry. Ada arrived at Los Angeles International Airport at 5:30 in the morning, her body aching from exhaustion. She'd spent the last 72 hours hunched over computers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, finalizing trajectory calculations for the Mars rover landing sequence. The numbers had to be perfect. 1 decimal point off and a $2.4 billion mission could end in disaster. She wore her most comfortable clothes for the 6-hour flight. Faded jeans, a soft gray hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days. After 3 days of barely sleeping, she couldn't imagine wearing anything else. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup. No jewelry except for small silver earrings. She looked like what she was. A tired scientist heading home after solving impossible problems. The check-in process went smoothly. Her first-class ticket printed without issues. The young woman behind the counter smiled and wished her a pleasant flight. Ada grabbed coffee from a nearby stand, black with 2 sugars, and made her way to gate 47. She sat in the waiting area, reviewing calculations on her laptop. The Mars rover would enter the Martian atmosphere in 96 hours. Every trajectory adjustment she'd made had to work perfectly. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but she loved it. This was why she'd spent 15 years earning her place at NASA. When the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Ada closed her laptop and stood. She was the first passenger to approach the jetway. The gate agent, a young Asian woman whose name tag read Helen Kim, scanned her boarding pass with a cheerful smile. But at the entrance to the jetway stood someone else entirely. Captain Warren Hayes was greeting first-class passengers personally. He was a tall white man in his 50s with silver hair combed back perfectly. 4 golden stripes gleamed on his dark blue uniform shoulders. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome once but had hardened into something cold and judgmental. When Ada approached, his welcoming smile vanished like someone had flipped a switch. "Boarding pass, please," he said, his tone suddenly flat. Ada held it out. He took it and studied it for what felt like an eternity. His eyes moved from the pass to Ada's face, then back to the pass. He turned it over as if checking for forgery. "This is your ticket?" he asked. "Yes," Ada replied, keeping her voice steady. "May I see your identification?" Ada pulled out her driver's license and handed it over. Hayes held it up to the light, comparing the photo to her face repeatedly. Other passengers were beginning to line up behind her. She could feel their impatience building. Hayes looked from the ID to Ada's worn sneakers, then up to her tired face. His expression said everything his mouth didn't. "Are you certain this seat assignment is correct?" he asked. "I'm certain," Ada said. Her jaw tightened. "First class is quite expensive. How did you afford this ticket?" The question landed like a slap. Behind her, Ada heard someone shift uncomfortably. The line of waiting passengers had grown to 6 people now, all of them white, all of them watching. "My employer purchased it," Ada said, her voice still controlled but with an edge now. "And what is it you do?" Hayes asked, one eyebrow raised skeptically. "I'm an engineer." Hayes actually smirked. The expression was brief but unmistakable. He didn't believe her. "I see," he said in a tone that communicated he saw nothing of the sort. Well, there seems to be some confusion with your ticket. Perhaps you should speak with the gate agent about finding a more appropriate seat. There's no confusion, Ada said firmly. My ticket is correct. I have critical work to complete during this flight and I need to board now. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside. Why? Ada asked directly. Hayes straightened to his full height. I am the captain of this aircraft. I have the authority to deny boarding to any passenger I deem inappropriate or suspicious. The word hung in the air. Suspicious. What exactly is suspicious about me? Ada asked, her voice ice cold now. Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Helen Kim. Please arrange for this passenger to be rebooked on a later flight in a more suitable section. Behind Ada, one of the waiting passengers, a middle-aged white woman in expensive jewelry, clutched her designer purse tighter to her body. Another passenger looked down at his phone, suddenly very interested in his screen. No one spoke up. Ada felt the familiar burn of humiliation and rage mixing in her chest. She'd felt it before. In college when a professor assumed she was in the wrong classroom. At conferences when people mistook her for administrative staff. In meetings where men talked over her until she had to raise her voice to be heard. But she'd learned long ago that showing anger would only confirm their biases. So she kept her voice level and pulled out her phone. Captain Hayes, she said slowly, making sure her phone was recording. I'm asking you to state clearly, for the record, why you are denying me boarding when I have a valid ticket and identification. Hayes's face reddened. I don't need to explain my decisions to you. Put that phone away immediately. I have every right to record this interaction. Security. Hayes called out sharply. Helen Kim looked stricken. She picked up her phone with shaking hands. Within 2 minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived. Both were white men in their 30s, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter with a military bearing. Their name tags read Rodriguez and Chen. This passenger is causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with crew instructions, Hayes told them immediately. Ada turned to the officers, her phone still recording. I haven't caused any disturbance. I presented a valid ticket and ID. This captain is refusing to let me board based on my appearance. This is racial discrimination. Rodriguez, the taller officer, looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, can I see your identification please? Ada reached for her wallet. As she pulled it out, several cards scattered onto the floor. Credit cards, her gym membership, a coffee shop loyalty card. Rodriguez bent to help pick them up. That's when he saw it. Among the scattered cards was a distinctive badge. Blue and white with an official seal. Rodriguez picked it up and froze. He read the text aloud, his voice changing completely. Dar. Ada Mitchell. Senior Aerospace Engineer. Jet Propulsion Laboratory. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Rodriguez looked from the NASA badge to Ada's face, then to Captain Hayes. The entire dynamic had shifted in an instant. His partner, Officer Chen, leaned in to look at the badge himself. Ma'am, Rodriguez said carefully. This is legitimate. Yes, Ada replied. I've been working on the Mars exploration program for the past 72 hours. I'm flying to Houston for critical meetings at Johnson Space Center regarding the rover landing sequence. The landing window is in 96 hours. If I miss these meetings, months of work could be compromised. Rodriguez turned to Hayes. Captain, perhaps we should reconsider this situation. Hayes's jaw clenched. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. My decision stands. This isn't about her credentials. It's about her attitude and behavior from the moment she approached the gate. My attitude? Ada's voice finally showed her anger. I showed you my ticket. I showed you my ID. I answered your questions politely. What behavior are you referring to? Your tone has been confrontational from the start, Hayes said. Because you questioned my right to board a flight I paid for. By now, at least a dozen passengers had their phones out, recording. The scene was escalating quickly. Rodriguez could see it spiraling out of control. Captain Hayes, Rodriguez tried again. This is a NASA scientist. She has legitimate business travel. Perhaps we could verify her credentials and allow boarding. Officer, I don't tell you how to do your job. Don't tell me how to do mine. Hayes's face had gone from red to almost purple. I have the legal authority to deny boarding to any passenger for any reason I deem necessary for the safety and security of my aircraft and crew. I am exercising that authority now. Rodriguez looked genuinely torn. He knew Hayes was technically correct about his authority. Captains did have broad discretion. But he also recognized this was blatant discrimination. The optics were terrible. A NASA scientist being treated like a criminal because of how she looked. Sir, I really think we should call a supervisor, Rodriguez said. I don't need a supervisor. I need you to escort this woman away from my gate so we can board our legitimate passengers and depart on time. Helen Kim, who had been watching with growing distress, suddenly spoke up. I've called Mr. Torres. He's on his way. Hayes glared at her but said nothing. The tension was unbearable. Other passengers whispered to each other. More phones came out. Ada stood perfectly still, her phone still recording, her NASA badge now visible in Rodriguez's hand. Then Michael Torres arrived, practically jogging down the concourse. He was a black man in his 40s wearing an airline supervisor uniform, slightly out of breath. He took in the scene instantly. The white captain blocking the gate. The black woman with security officers. The crowd of filming passengers. The NASA badge. His expression went from concern to barely controlled fury in seconds. What's going on here? Torres asked, though his eyes on the NASA badge suggested he already knew. Hayes started to speak but Torres held up a hand. Ms. Mitchell, is it? Can you please explain what happened? Ada kept her voice steady as she recounted everything. The questioning about her ticket. The disbelief about her occupation. The suggestion she belonged in a different section. The refusal to board. She spoke clearly and without embellishment. The facts were damning enough. Torres turned to Hayes. Captain, is this accurate? I exercised my professional judgment as captain, Hayes said stiffly. Your professional judgment told you a NASA scientist with a valid first-class ticket was suspicious. I wasn't aware of her credentials when I made my initial assessment. What were you aware of? Torres asked pointedly. The question hung in the air. Everyone knew what he was really asking. What did you see that made you suspicious? What about her appearance triggered your judgment? Hayes didn't answer. Torres picked up the NASA badge from Rodriguez's hand and examined it. Dar. Mitchell, I apologize profoundly for this situation. I'm going to get you on this flight immediately. No, Hayes said firmly. She is not boarding my aircraft. Torres turned to face Hayes directly. Captain, I strongly advise you to reconsider. We have very clear policies against discrimination. I'm not discriminating. I'm making a safety judgment call. Based on what safety concern exactly? Hayes's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was. The standoff continued for another tense minute. Finally, Hayes turned on his heel. Fine. Do what you want. But document that I objected for the record. He strode back into the jetway toward his aircraft. Torres exhaled slowly. He looked at Ada with genuine regret. Dr. Mitchell, again, I'm so sorry. Please, let's get you boarded. But Ada's exhaustion had finally cracked. You know what? No. I don't want to board that plane with that man flying it. I don't trust him. And I shouldn't have to spend 6 hours wondering if the pilot who thinks I don't belong in first class is going to get me safely to Houston. Torres nodded slowly. I understand completely. Let me book you on the next flight. First class, naturally. And I'm going to personally file a formal complaint about Captain Hayes. Will anything actually happen? Ada asked quietly. Torres met her eyes. They both knew the answer. These complaints usually led nowhere. A note in a file. Maybe a conversation with HR. Maybe nothing at all. I'll make sure it does, Torres promised, though they both heard the uncertainty in his voice. Behind them, Flight 447 began boarding its other passengers. Ada watched them file past, these people who had witnessed her humiliation and said nothing. The woman with the expensive purse wouldn't meet her eyes. Ada sat down heavily in a waiting area seat. Rodriguez handed back her NASA badge. She tucked it into her wallet with shaking hands. What she didn't know was that 7 different passengers had recorded the entire confrontation. Within 30 minutes of Flight 447 pushing back from the gate, those videos would be uploaded to social media. And Ada's life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Ada sat in the quiet gate area, watching Flight 447 disappear down the taxiway through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Michael Torres sat beside her, making arrangements on his phone for her rebooking. His jaw was tight with barely suppressed anger. Next flight to Houston departs at 11:15, he said. I've put you in first class, seat 2A. I'm also issuing you a travel voucher for the inconvenience. I don't want a voucher, Ada said quietly. I want Captain Hayes held accountable. Torres nodded. I'm documenting everything. Photos of your credentials, statements from the gate agent, security footage. This won't be swept under the rug. But Ada had heard that before. She pulled out her phone to call her supervisor at JPL. Before she could dial, notifications started flooding her screen. Twitter mentions. Instagram tags. Facebook messages. Dozens, then hundreds. She clicked on one. It was a video of the confrontation. The caption read. NASA scientist denied boarding by racist pilot. It already had 15,000 views and climbing. Oh no, Ada whispered. Torres looked at her screen and his eyes widened. Dr. Mitchell, I think you should know that this is going to get very big very fast. He was right. By the time Ada boarded her 11:15 flight 3 hours later, the videos had been viewed over 2 million times. The hashtags had started. Flying while black. NASA scientist denied boarding. Boycott Atlantic. Her name was trending nationally. The flight attendants on the second flight recognized her immediately. They were painfully polite, clearly having been briefed by management to handle her with extreme care. The other first-class passengers stared. Some whispered. One older white man smiled sympathetically and gave her a thumbs up. Ada pulled out her laptop and tried to focus on her Mars trajectory calculations. The numbers blurred on the screen. She kept seeing Captain Hayes's face. Kept hearing his question. How did you afford this ticket? As if her presence in first class required explanation and justification. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from colleagues. Friends from grad school she hadn't spoken to in years. Reporters requesting interviews. Civil rights organizations offering support. It was overwhelming. She typed a brief statement on her phone's notes app. I'm grateful for the support, but I ask for privacy so I can focus on my work. This isn't about one pilot. It's about systemic issues that affect countless people who don't have platforms to fight back. She posted it to Twitter and Instagram, then put her phone in airplane mode. The flight itself was uneventful. 6 hours of trying not to think about the morning's humiliation while differential equations swam before her eyes. When they landed in Houston, Ada hoped she could slip out quietly. No such luck. Someone had leaked her flight information. A cluster of reporters waited near the gate. Camera flashes went off as she emerged from the jetway. Microphones thrust toward her face. "Dr. Mitchell, how do you feel about what happened? Will you sue the airline? What do you want to happen to the pilot?" Ada stopped. She was exhausted and humiliated and angry. But she was also a black woman in America who understood that how she handled this moment mattered. "I want accountability," she said clearly. "Not just for me, but for every person of color who faces discrimination and has no voice to fight back. I want training. I want policy changes. I want people to think twice before making assumptions about who belongs where based on skin color." Then she walked through the crowd to a waiting car from NASA. The meetings at Johnson Space Center should have been the highlight of her week. She was presenting trajectory calculations to some of the brightest minds in aerospace engineering. Her work was flawless. The Mars rover landing sequence checked out perfectly. Every variable accounted for, every contingency planned. But she couldn't focus properly. During a break, a white colleague named Dr. Richard Palmer approached her. "Saw what happened this morning," he said awkwardly. "That's terrible. I'm sure the airline will make it right." Ada looked at him. Richard was a nice guy. Brilliant physicist. He'd never experienced what she'd experienced that morning. Never would. "Will they?" she asked. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I mean, they have to, right? With all the attention." Ada didn't answer. She'd seen too many cases where attention faded and nothing changed. That evening, alone in her Houston hotel room, Ada watched herself on the evening news. Every major network led with the story. NASA scientist barred from flight by discriminatory pilot. Aviation experts discussed captain authority. Civil rights lawyers explained discrimination law. The airline had released a statement: "We take these matters extremely seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind." It was the same corporate language used in 1,000 similar incidents. Professional. Non-committal. Meaningless. Ada's phone rang. It was Dr. Raymond Foster, her supervisor at JPL. "Ada, are you okay?" His concern was genuine. "I'm fine," she lied. "The rover landing is in 72 hours. Do you need more time?" "No. My calculations are solid. The mission is ready." "That's not what I asked. Do you need time for yourself?" Ada's throat tightened. "Ray, I just want to do my job. I want to land this rover and prove that I earned my place at that table. I earned my seat on that plane. I earned everything I have." "You've never had to prove that to me," Foster said gently. But Ada knew she'd been proving it her whole life. And she was tired. Meanwhile, in Orange County, California, Captain Warren Hayes sat in his living room watching the same news coverage. His wife, Patricia, sat beside him looking worried. "Warren, this looks bad." "It's overblown," Hayes said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I made a judgment call. How was I supposed to know she really worked for NASA? She didn't look like a scientist." "What does a scientist look like?" Patricia asked quietly. Hayes didn't answer. He couldn't say what he was thinking. That scientists were supposed to look professional. Put together. Not like someone who just rolled out of bed in sneakers and a hoodie. But even in his own mind, he knew how that sounded. His phone rang. It was his chief pilot. The conversation was brief and devastating. Hayes was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Effective immediately. Hayes hung up and stared at the television. The video of him blocking Ada from boarding played on loop. His expression in those frames looked exactly like what it was. Contemptuous. Dismissive. Prejudiced. For the first time, a small seed of doubt planted itself in his mind. Had he been wrong? The airline's crisis management team worked through the night. By 6 a.m., the situation had spiraled beyond anything they'd handled before. Boycott Atlantic was the #1 trending hashtag in the United States. Celebrities were sharing the videos. Congressional representatives were calling for investigations. The airline stock had dropped 3% in after-hours trading. Margaret Walsh, the CEO, convened an emergency meeting in the glass-walled conference room at corporate headquarters. 12 executives sat around the table, all looking grim. "Walk me through exactly what happened," Walsh said. The head of operations pulled up the security footage and passenger videos on the conference room screen. They watched Captain Hayes block Ada from boarding. Watched him question her ticket, her identification, her right to be there. Watched him call security on a NASA scientist carrying valid credentials. Walsh's expression grew darker with each passing second. "Tell me we have some justification for his actions," she said. "Tell me there was an actual security concern." The head of security shook his head. "Nothing. No flags in her background check, no concerning behavior, no legitimate reason to deny boarding. Hayes filed no preliminary report, documented no suspicious activity. He just didn't think she belonged in first class." "Because she's black," Walsh said flatly. The room fell silent. "Get me Hayes's complete personnel file," Walsh ordered. "Every incident report he's ever filed. Every complaint. Everything." By 7 a.m., Hayes received the call. Administrative leave. Pending investigation. He was furious. "This is ridiculous," he told the HR representative. "I followed protocol." "What protocol requires questioning a passenger about how they afforded their ticket?" the representative asked. "I had concerns about the validity of her boarding pass." "Did those concerns disappear when you saw she was white?" "Because our records show you've never questioned a white first-class passenger's credentials." Hayes hung up and immediately called his union representative. The pilots' union was in a difficult position. They had a legal obligation to represent Hayes. But the union president, Captain Diana Martinez, watched the videos and winced. This wasn't a gray area. This was clear-cut discrimination caught on camera from multiple angles. "Warren," she said when she called him back. "I'm going to be straight with you. The union will provide you with legal representation as required. But I need you to understand how bad this looks." "I made a judgment call," Hayes insisted. "Based on what?" "Her sneakers. Her hoodie. Warren, she's a senior aerospace engineer at NASA. She's more qualified to be in first class than most of our passengers. What made you think she didn't belong there?" Hayes couldn't answer that question honestly. Not even to himself. While Hayes struggled with his situation, NASA was taking action. The agency's administrator, Kenneth Bradford, released a strongly worded statement praising Dr. Mitchell's professionalism and condemning discrimination in all forms. More significantly, NASA announced they were reviewing their corporate travel contracts with the airline. It was a subtle threat but a powerful one. NASA spent $70 million annually on flights for personnel, equipment transport, and mission support. Losing that contract would hurt. In Houston, Ada was trying to work. The Mars rover landing was now 60 hours away. Every calculation had to be verified and re-verified. But the stress was crushing. Her phone had 15,000 unread messages. Every news outlet wanted an interview. She released a second statement through NASA's Public Affairs Office. "I appreciate the overwhelming support, but I need to focus on my work. The success of this mission is bigger than any individual incident. I ask for privacy during this critical time." The media respected her wishes for about 6 hours. Then a conservative news outlet published an interview with Captain Hayes. Hayes presented himself as a victim of political correctness run amok. He claimed he'd had legitimate concerns about Ada's boarding pass that had nothing to do with race. He suggested the real story was about how a veteran pilot with an impeccable safety record was being crucified for doing his job. "I've served this airline for 20 years, Hayes said to the camera. "I've never had a safety incident. I've flown millions of miles. And now my career is being destroyed because I made one judgment call that people disagree with. Where's the fairness in that?" The interview generated its own wave of controversy. Some people bought into Hayes's narrative. Most didn't. The videos were too clear. His contempt too obvious. But the interview did accomplish one thing. It prompted the airline's investigation team to dig deeper into Hayes's record. What they found was damning. In 20 years, Hayes had filed 47 passenger incident reports. That alone wasn't unusual. But when the team broke down the demographics, a pattern emerged that couldn't be ignored. 39 of those 47 reports involved passengers of color. 16 black passengers, 14 Latino passengers, 9 Asian passengers. Only 8 involved white passengers, and those 8 all involved suspected intoxication or actual disturbances. Hayes had denied boarding to 18 passengers in his career. 16 of them were people of color. The 2 white passengers he denied boarding to had both been visibly intoxicated and verbally abusive. The pattern was undeniable and indefensible. The airline's legal team advised immediate termination. Hayes was a liability. The evidence of systematic discrimination was clear. The damage to the brand was severe. Every day he remained employed, even on leave, made the situation worse. On the 3rd day after the incident, the airline announced Captain Warren Hayes had been terminated for violating company policies regarding discrimination and customer service. Hayes's response was immediate. He filed a wrongful termination lawsuit claiming he was being scapegoated to satisfy an angry mob. His lawyer argued that captains must be allowed to make judgment calls without fear of retribution. Conservative legal organizations rallied to his cause, seeing the case as an example of cancel culture destroying a good man's career over one mistake. But the evidence kept mounting against him. Internal emails were subpoenaed. Messages to other pilots containing casual racist jokes. Complaints about those people in first class. References to passengers he deemed suspicious, described in racially coded language. One email from 2 years earlier was particularly damning. Hayes had written to another pilot, "Had to deal with another ghetto passenger trying to use a first-class ticket today. I swear they're running some kind of scam. Made sure to check her out thoroughly before letting her on." The passenger in question had been a black female attorney traveling for work. While Hayes's world crumbled, Ada was facing her own crisis. The Mars rover was entering its final approach phase. She was in the control room at JPL, surrounded by monitors and the best aerospace engineers in the world. Her calculations had to be perfect. The rover would hit the Martian atmosphere at 12,000 miles per hour. Her trajectory equations would determine if it landed safely in Jezero crater or became a $2.4 billion crater itself. But part of her mind was still on that jetway. Still seeing Hayes's face. Still hearing the question that implied she didn't belong. She forced herself to focus. Checked the numbers again. Ran simulations. Verified every variable. Everything was ready. Now they just had to wait. "Now, before we see what happens next, I need to ask you something. If you believe that discrimination like this has no place in our society, comment number 1 below. If you think Captain Hayes deserved to be fired, smash that like button. And if you want to see more stories of people standing up to injustice, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. But here's the real question. Ada's about to face the biggest moment of her professional career with the weight of this discrimination still on her shoulders. Can she succeed despite everything that's happened? Or will this incident haunt her during the most critical hours of the mission? Let's find out what happens when the rover reaches Mars. 60 hours after the incident at LAX, Ada sat at her console in the Space Flight Operations Facility at JPL. The room hummed with focused energy. 37 engineers, scientists, and mission specialists occupied their stations, eyes locked on screens displaying telemetry data from a spacecraft hurtling toward Mars at incomprehensible speed. Ada's fingers moved across her keyboard, pulling up the final trajectory calculations one more time. The numbers had to be perfect. In 18 minutes, the Mars rover Perseverance would hit the Martian atmosphere. Her equations would determine everything that happened next. Flight, this is guidance. All systems nominal, someone called out. Copy that, guidance, the flight director responded. Ada's screen showed the descent profile she'd calculated. 7 minutes of terror, they called it. 7 minutes when the rover would decelerate from 12,000 miles per hour to zero, deploying a parachute, firing retro rockets, and finally lowering itself to the surface on a sky crane. All autonomously, because the radio delay from Mars meant they couldn't control anything in real time. Every second of that descent depended on calculations Ada had spent months perfecting. Entry interface in 10 minutes, the flight director announced. Ada's hands were steady, but her heart hammered. Dr. Raymond Foster stood behind her station, one hand on her shoulder. Your numbers are perfect, he said quietly. You know that. Ada nodded. She did know. She'd checked them 1,000 times. But knowing and feeling were different things. Entry interface in 5 minutes. The room's energy shifted. Conversation stopped. Everyone watched their screens. Ada thought about the jetway. About Captain Hayes's contemptuous expression. About all the times she'd had to prove she belonged somewhere she'd earned the right to be. This moment was proof. This was her belonging made manifest. Entry interface in 60 seconds. Ada's screen showed the predicted trajectory as a green line arcing down to the Martian surface. Reality would either match that line or deviate from it. If her calculations were wrong, the deviation would be catastrophic. Entry interface. 300 million miles away, the spacecraft slammed into the Martian atmosphere. In the control room, they watched telemetry data stream back at the speed of light, delayed by 11 minutes. We have signal, someone called out. Numbers flooded Ada's screen. Velocity, altitude, atmospheric density, heat shield temperature. She compared them to her predicted values. Perfect match. Parachute deploy in 90 seconds. Ada's breathing steadied. The numbers were holding. Her calculations were right. Parachute deployed. A cheer went up. The chute had opened exactly when and where Ada's equations said it would. Radar locked. Altitude 5,000 meters and descending. Heat shield separation confirmed. Beginning powered descent. The retro rockets fired precisely on schedule. Ada watched the altitude numbers drop. 4,000 meters. 3,000. 2,000. Sky crane maneuver initiated. This was the most complex part. The rover would be lowered on cables while the descent stage hovered above, its rockets keeping it stable. Ada had calculated the exact thrust values needed. 1,000 meters. 500 meters. Touchdown confirmed. The room exploded in celebration. People hugged. Someone was crying. Dr. Foster pulled Ada into a tight embrace. You did it, he said. Perfect landing. Ada felt tears on her own cheeks. The rover was safe. Her calculations had worked. Months of 18-hour days, of checking and rechecking every equation, of carrying the weight of a $2.4 billion mission on her shoulders. It had all worked. And for a moment, she forgot about everything else. This was pure achievement. Pure joy. The celebration lasted for hours. Press conferences. Congratulatory calls from NASA headquarters, from the White House, from scientific organizations around the world. Ada gave interviews, her face beaming, describing the landing sequence and what came next. But the media coverage didn't just focus on the mission success. Headlines read, "Scientist denied boarding lands Mars rover perfectly." "Woman pilot called suspicious executes flawless space mission." "NASA engineer proves discriminatory captain catastrophically wrong." The irony was impossible to miss. The woman Captain Hayes thought didn't belong in first class had just successfully landed a spacecraft on another planet. In Orange County, Warren Hayes watched the coverage. He sat alone in his house. Patricia had left that morning, moving in with her sister. The divorce papers would be filed within a week. Hayes stared at the screen showing Ada's smiling face as she described the landing sequence to reporters. Her joy was unmistakable. Her brilliance undeniable. He'd spent the past 3 days researching her background. Trying to understand who he'd actually denied boarding to. Ada Mitchell. Born in Birmingham, Alabama. Full scholarship to MIT, graduated top of her class. Master's degree from Stanford. PhD in aerospace engineering at 26. 15 years at NASA. Over 40 published papers in aerospace journals. Lead engineer on 3 successful Mars missions. Awards from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the Society of Women Engineers, the National Society of Black Engineers. She wasn't just qualified. She was exceptional. And Hayes had looked at her worn sneakers and tired face and decided she didn't belong. For the first time, genuine shame cut through his defensive anger. He'd ruined his career, destroyed his marriage, and humiliated himself. And for what? Because a brilliant scientist didn't match his mental image of what a first-class passenger should look like. He opened his laptop and began typing an email. "Dr. Mitchell," he wrote. "I know I have no right to contact you, and you have every reason to ignore this message. But I need to say something." He paused, trying to find words adequate to the situation. There weren't any. "I was wrong. Not just wrong in my judgment, but wrong in my assumptions, my biases, and my actions. You deserved better from me and from the airline I represented. I let prejudices I didn't even realize I had dictate my decisions. I'm sorry." He stared at the words. They felt inadequate. Empty. But he sent the email anyway, through NASA's public contact form. At JPL, Ada's supervisor intercepted the message before it reached her. "Hayes sent you an apology," Dr. Foster told her. "Do you want to see it?" Ada was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No. An apology doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't erase the humiliation or make the incident disappear. I've moved on. He should too." Foster nodded and deleted the email. But while Ada tried to move forward, the legal and corporate consequences continued to unfold. The airline faced a class action lawsuit filed by civil rights organizations on behalf of all passengers who had experienced discrimination. The potential damages ran into tens of millions. Airlines across the industry began reviewing their policies. Training programs on implicit bias were hastily implemented. The FAA announced it was examining the issue of captain discretion and whether additional oversight was needed. Hayes's wrongful termination lawsuit was going poorly. His lawyer advised settling and walking away. But Hayes couldn't let go. He'd lost everything. He wanted someone to acknowledge that he'd been a good pilot for 20 years. That one mistake shouldn't erase an entire career. But the evidence kept contradicting him. More passengers came forward with stories of being questioned, delayed, or denied boarding by Hayes. The pattern was undeniable. 3 weeks after the incident, Hayes's lawsuit was dismissed. The judge ruled that the airline had clear grounds for termination based on documented patterns of discriminatory behavior. Hayes had nothing left. No job. No marriage. No reputation. Just the growing realization that he'd destroyed his own life through prejudices he'd never even examined. 6 weeks after Ada's confrontation with Captain Hayes, the Federal Aviation Administration released preliminary findings from its investigation into discrimination complaints against airlines. The data was shocking. Over the past decade, the FAA had received 12,800 complaints alleging discrimination by airline personnel. Passengers of color denied boarding, removed from flights, subjected to additional screening, or questioned about their tickets at rates dramatically higher than white passengers. Most complaints had been dismissed or resulted in no meaningful consequences. The report made national news. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Transportation Secretary Williams testified that the findings were unacceptable and promised comprehensive reforms. But it was the personal stories that resonated most powerfully. Dr. Marcus Green, a black cardiologist from Atlanta, came forward with his experience. He'd been removed from a flight after a white passenger complained that he looked suspicious sleeping in first class wearing a hoodie. The pilot had sided with the complaining passenger without even speaking to Dr. Green. Juanita Rodriguez, a Latina businesswoman and CEO of a tech startup, shared how she'd been asked to prove she could afford her ticket 3 times in 1 year. Each time by different airline staff members. Each time while wearing business attire and carrying a laptop bag with her company logo. Professor Lin Chen described being subjected to additional security screening on 8 consecutive flights. Each time, TSA agents told him it was random selection. The statistical probability of truly random selection 8 times in a row was microscopic. The stories piled up. Each one a data point in a larger pattern of systemic discrimination. Ada watched the testimonies and felt a complicated mix of emotions. She was glad people were speaking up. Glad the issue was getting attention. But she also felt the weight of becoming a symbol rather than simply being allowed to be a scientist doing her work. She declined most interview requests. But she agreed to testify before the House Transportation Committee when formally invited. The hearing room was packed. News cameras lined the walls. Ada sat at the witness table, a glass of water before her, her NASA credentials displayed on a name placard. Representative Johnson, the committee chair, addressed her directly. Dr. Mitchell, thank you for being here. Can you describe what happened on the morning of February 14th? Ada took a breath and told the story. She kept her voice steady and her recounting factual. The questioning about her ticket. The disbelief about her profession. The humiliation of being denied boarding while other passengers watched. How did this incident affect you professionally? Representative Johnson asked. I had critical meetings at Johnson Space Center that day, Ada replied. Meetings I made on time only because I was rebooked on a later flight. But the incident itself affected my focus during one of the most important weeks of my career. I was preparing for a Mars rover landing that depended on calculations I'd spent months perfecting. I should have been able to focus entirely on that mission. Instead, I was dealing with the emotional aftermath of being discriminated against. Yet the landing was successful. Yes. Because I'm good at my job. Because I've spent 15 years proving I'm good at my job. But I shouldn't have to prove my worth to an airline captain who made assumptions based on my appearance. That's not about competence. It's about bias. Representative Martinez, a Latina congresswoman from California, leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell, you mentioned proving yourself. How often do you feel you have to do that? Ada paused. The question cut deep. Every day, she said quietly. In every meeting where I'm the only black woman in the room. Every conference where people assume I'm administrative staff rather than a senior engineer. Every time someone is surprised by my credentials. I've published 43 papers in peer-reviewed journals. I have a PhD from Stanford. I've worked on 4 successful Mars missions. And I still have to justify my presence in spaces I've more than earned the right to occupy. The hearing room was absolutely silent. The incident with Captain Hayes wasn't unique, Ada continued. It was just unusually well documented. I've been questioned about my credentials, my qualifications, my right to be somewhere dozens of times throughout my career. Usually, there's no video. No witnesses willing to speak up. You just absorb the humiliation and move on because what else can you do? Representative Johnson nodded slowly. What changes do you think need to happen? Ada had prepared for this question. Systematic training on implicit bias for all airline personnel. Clear protocols for boarding decisions that require documentation and supervisor approval. Transparent reporting of discrimination complaints with public accountability. And consequences that actually mean something. Captain Hayes was fired, but only because this incident went viral. What about all the other discriminatory actions that don't get filmed? She paused, then added, and honestly, we need to acknowledge that this isn't just an airline problem. It's everywhere. In medicine, where black patients' pain is taken less seriously. In education, where black students are disciplined more harshly for the same behaviors as white students. In housing, in hiring, in everyday interactions. The airplane was just where my experience happened to be caught on camera. The committee heard from other witnesses throughout the day. Airline executives promised reforms. Civil rights lawyers outlined legal remedies. Pilots and flight attendants discussed the culture within airlines that enabled discrimination. Captain Julia Santos testified about her experience as one of the few Latina commercial pilots. She described being asked by passengers if she was really qualified to fly the plane. Being questioned about her credentials by gate agents who assumed she was a flight attendant. The constant microaggressions that wore down your confidence and sense of belonging. The problem isn't just individual bad actors like Captain Hayes, Santos said. It's a culture that allows those bad actors to thrive unchecked for 20 years. Hayes filed 47 incident reports over his career. 39 involved passengers of color. No one noticed the pattern until Dr. Mitchell's case went viral. Why not? It was a question no one could adequately answer. While Washington held hearings, the airline industry was implementing changes. Some genuine, some performative. Mandatory implicit bias training became standard across major carriers. The quality of that training varied wildly. Some programs brought in civil rights experts and psychologists for meaningful education. Others showed a 30-minute video and called it done. Airlines began tracking demographic data on boarding denials and passenger complaints. The numbers were eye-opening. Passengers of color were denied boarding at nearly 3 times the rate of white passengers, even when controlling for ticket class and behavior. Some airlines appointed diversity officers. Others created passenger complaint review boards. A few implemented systems requiring supervisor approval before any passenger could be denied boarding. The FAA issued new regulations. Captains would still have authority to deny boarding, but they had to document specific safety concerns. Generic claims of suspicious behavior were no longer sufficient. Airlines had to track and report discrimination complaints quarterly. Captains with patterns of discriminatory boarding denials faced certificate suspension. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Some pilots' unions complained about overreach and second-guessing of professional judgment. Conservative commentators argued it was political correctness run amok. But the data was undeniable. The pattern was clear. And slowly, things began to shift. For Warren Hayes, these industry-wide changes meant nothing. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. His personal life in ruins. He sat in his small apartment, a dramatic downgrade from the house he'd lost in the divorce, watching news coverage of the congressional hearings. He saw Ada testify. Saw her describe the incident with painful accuracy. And for the first time, he truly understood what he'd done. Not just to Ada, though that was bad enough, but to every passenger of color he'd ever questioned unnecessarily. Every person he'd made feel like they didn't belong based on nothing but his own biases. He'd spent 20 years thinking he was a good pilot doing his job well. Now he had to confront the possibility that he'd spent 20 years being a discriminatory bully with authority. Hayes began reading everything he could find about implicit bias and systemic racism. Not because his lawyer suggested it might help his case. The case was lost. But because he needed to understand how he'd become this person. He read about redlining and housing discrimination. About disparities in education and healthcare. About the cumulative weight of 1,000 small discriminations that people of color faced daily. He thought about his 47 incident reports. About the black passengers he'd scrutinized more carefully. The Latino families he'd watched more closely. The assumptions he'd made without ever questioning them. The realization was crushing. He'd been racist. Not in the obvious way of using slurs or joining hate groups. But in the insidious way of unconscious bias turned into discriminatory action. And he'd had the power to make those actions consequential. Every time he denied someone boarding or delayed their travel or subjected them to extra questioning, he'd used the authority of his position to enforce his prejudices. Hayes wrote another letter to Ada. Longer this time. More honest. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged the truth of what he'd done and the harm he'd caused. He mailed it to NASA headquarters. He never received a response. He didn't expect one. 6 months after the incident, Ada stood at a podium addressing 300 young women at the National Society of Black Engineers conference. The Mars rover was exceeding all expectations, sending back groundbreaking data about ancient Martian lake beds. Ada's work was being recognized with awards. She'd been promoted to lead systems engineer for NASA's upcoming Europa mission. But she was here today for a different reason. When I was denied boarding 6 months ago, she told the audience, I could have stayed quiet. Accepted the later flight. Taken the settlement the airline offered. Moved on. The young women listened intently. Many of them wore NASA shirts or engineering program hoodies. But I didn't stay quiet. Not for me. For every young woman in this room who will face discrimination in your careers. Because you will face it. Not might. Will. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Bright, eager, talented young black women preparing to enter fields where they'd often be the only person who looked like them in the room. You'll be questioned about your credentials. Doubted about your competence. Asked to prove yourself in ways your white peers never have to. And it's not fair. It's exhausting. Some days it will make you want to give up. Ada's voice strengthened. Don't give up. Be brilliant anyway. Be excellent anyway. Take up space in rooms where people don't expect you. And when discrimination happens, document it. Report it. Make noise. Because silence protects the system. After her speech, a young woman approached. She introduced herself as Kennedy Williams, a sophomore studying aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech. Dr. Mitchell, I just wanted to say thank you. I saw what happened to you on the plane, and it made me so angry. But then I saw you land the Mars rover and I thought, that's who I want to be. Someone who doesn't let anyone make them small. Ada felt her throat tighten. This was why she'd spoken up. Not for the headlines or the lawsuits or the policy changes, though those mattered. But for young women like Kennedy who needed to see someone fight back and win. What's your focus area? Ada asked. Propulsion systems. I want to work on the rockets that'll take us to Mars. Then keep working. And when someone questions whether you belong, remember you absolutely do. Kennedy's eyes shone. I will. I promise. As Kennedy walked away, Ada thought about the cost and benefit of the past 6 months. The nightmares she still had about the jetway. The anxiety when boarding planes. The way she'd become known for this incident rather than just her work. But also the policy changes. The conversations happening in boardrooms and newsrooms. The young women inspired to push forward despite obstacles. Was it worth it? She still wasn't sure. Back in California, Warren Hayes sat in a windowless office dispatching cargo flights for a small freight company. The pay was a third of what he'd earned as a captain. The work was mind-numbing. But it was all he could get. His co-workers knew who he was. Some sympathized. Others avoided him. One pilot, a young black man named Terrell Jackson, made his disgust clear without saying a word. Hayes couldn't blame him. During his lunch break, Hayes saw Ada's speech trending on Twitter. He watched it on his phone, listening to her describe the ongoing impact of discrimination. Something shifted in him. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost. His career, his marriage, his reputation. He'd been wallowing in self-pity. But listening to Ada, he realized his loss wasn't the story. The story was the harm he'd caused. Not just to Ada, but to everyone he'd discriminated against over 20 years. Hayes made a decision. He started volunteering with an organization that taught aviation to underprivileged youth. Many of the students were black and Latino kids from neighborhoods where becoming a pilot seemed like an impossible dream. He wasn't trying to rebuild his career. That was over. He was trying to be useful. To give back in some small way. The program director, a former Air Force pilot named Colonel Sarah Martinez, was skeptical when Hayes first approached her. "Why should I let you anywhere near these kids?" she asked bluntly. Hayes didn't have a good answer except the truth. "Because I was wrong. And I'm trying to do better. If you'd rather I leave, I understand." Martinez studied him for a long moment. "You work with Terrence. He'll supervise you. If I hear one complaint, one hint of bias, you're gone. Clear. Crystal clear." Hayes started teaching basic aerodynamics to teenagers who'd never been in a cockpit. He discovered that his students, especially the students of color, had a hunger for knowledge that humbled him. One student, a 15-year-old black girl named Jasmine, reminded him painfully of Ada. Brilliant, focused, asking questions that showed she understood concepts most adults struggled with. "Mr. Hayes," she asked one day. "Do you really think I could be a pilot?" Hayes thought about Ada. About all the potential he'd dismissed because of how someone looked. "Jasmine, I think you could be anything you want. Don't let anyone tell you different. Not even me." It wasn't redemption. Hayes understood that. You didn't undo 20 years of discriminatory behavior with a few months of volunteering. But it was something. A start. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against the airline was settled for $85 million. The settlement included compensation for affected passengers, funding for expanded bias training, and oversight by a civil rights organization for 5 years. Ada, as the named plaintiff, received a significant portion. She donated most of it to establish a scholarship fund for black women in aerospace engineering. The ripple effects continued spreading. Other industries began examining their own discrimination issues. Hotels started tracking complaints by passenger demographics. Restaurants reviewed their seating policies. Retail stores looked at their security practices. Ada's case became a reference point. When someone faced discrimination and fought back, people invoked her name. Remember the NASA scientist? It became shorthand for refusing to accept unfair treatment. Not everyone saw this as progress. Some complained about cancel culture. Others said people were too sensitive. A few argued that individual cases of discrimination were being blown out of proportion. But the data told a different story. Systemic patterns revealed in industry after industry. discrimination wasn't rare or isolated. It was common and pervasive. For Ada, the attention remained overwhelming. She turned down most media requests. She focused on her work. The Europa mission was entering the preliminary design phase. She had spacecraft trajectories to calculate, orbital mechanics to model, landing systems to analyze. This was what she loved. The elegant mathematics of space flight. The impossible problem made possible through equations and engineering. But she also accepted select speaking engagements. Not to talk about discrimination, though that inevitably came up. But to talk about the science. To inspire young people, especially young women of color, to pursue aerospace careers. Because representation mattered. Seeing someone who looked like you doing the impossible made the impossible feel achievable. Ada's mentorship program grew. 47 young women were now participating, receiving scholarships, internships, and guidance. Some would make it to NASA. Others would work in private aerospace or research or teaching. But all of them would know that their place at the table was earned and deserved. And when they faced discrimination, as they inevitably would, they'd have Ada's example. Fight back. Document it. Don't accept being made small. The system was changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And Ada had been the catalyst, whether she wanted that role or not. 1 year after the incident, media outlets ran retrospectives. How one woman's humiliation changed an industry, was a common headline. Documentaries were proposed. Ada agreed to participate in one, with conditions. "I don't want this to be a redemption story," she told the director. "Not for me and especially not for Hayes. I wanted to focus on systemic issues, not just individual actions." The director, a black woman named Simone Taylor, nodded. "Absolutely. But I do have one request. Would you consider meeting Hayes on camera? To have a conversation about what happened and its aftermath?" Ada's immediate reaction was visceral rejection. "No. Absolutely not. I'm not interested in giving him a platform for his redemption arc." "I understand," Simone said carefully. "But this wouldn't be about his redemption. It would be about you having the opportunity to say things you didn't get to say on that jetway. To make him truly hear the impact of his actions." Ada was silent for a long moment. She discussed it with her therapist. With her family. With close friends. Finally, she agreed. Not for Hayes's benefit. For her own. There were things she needed to say, and she wanted him to hear them face to face. The meeting was scheduled at a neutral location with both a mediator and a therapist present. Ada arrived exactly on time. Hayes was already there, looking significantly older than he had a year ago. His hair had gone completely gray. Lines had deepened around his eyes and mouth. He stood when she entered. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to this." Ada didn't offer to shake hands. She sat across from him at a small table. The cameras were positioned to capture both their faces. The mediator, Dr. Patricia Chen, explained the ground rules. Each person would have uninterrupted time to speak. No arguing. No interrupting. Just honest expression and genuine listening. Hayes started to speak. "Dr. Mitchell, I want to apologize for." Ada cut him off. "Stop. I'm not here for your apology. I'm here to tell you what that day cost me. And I need you to listen without making this about your guilt or your growth or your journey. This isn't about you." Hayes closed his mouth and nodded. Ada took a breath. "That morning, I had just finished 72 hours of work on calculations for a Mars landing. I was exhausted. I dressed comfortably for a long flight so I could work and rest. And you looked at my clothes, my face, my skin, and decided I didn't belong." Her voice remained steady, but pain underscored every word. "You questioned my ticket like I'd stolen it. You asked how I afforded first class like I couldn't possibly have earned enough to pay for it. You called security on me while other passengers watched and did nothing. You humiliated me in front of dozens of people based on nothing but your assumptions about who I am. Hayes's face had gone pale, but he stayed silent. Do you know what that feels like? Ada continued. To have your credentials, your intelligence, your worth questioned because of how you look. To be made to feel like you need to justify your presence in a space you have every right to be in. I still have nightmares about that jetway, Ada said. I still feel anxiety when I board planes. I still see people looking at me in first class and wonder if they're questioning my right to be there. Your moment of prejudice became a defining moment of my life. She paused, then added, and professionally. Some people now only know me as that NASA scientist who was discriminated against rather than for the work I've actually done. I've landed spacecraft on Mars. I'm leading the Europa mission. I've published 43 peer-reviewed papers. But when people Google my name, they read about you denying me boarding. Hayes's eyes filled with tears. Ada didn't care. You used your position of authority to enforce your biases, she said. And you did it for 20 years. How many other people did you discriminate against who didn't have my platform to fight back? How many people just absorbed the humiliation and moved on because they had no choice? I don't know, Hayes said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken. Exactly. You don't know. And those are the people you really owe. Not me. The ones whose names you don't remember. Whose faces you didn't see in the news. Who experienced your discrimination and had nowhere to turn. The room was silent except for the low hum of the cameras. Ada leaned forward. I need to know something. Have you actually changed? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Hayes met her eyes. I'd like to say I've completely changed. That I've examined all my biases and eliminated them. But honestly, Dr. Mitchell, I don't know. I'm trying. I'm learning. I volunteer with kids, teaching them aviation. But that doesn't undo what I did. It doesn't make me a good person. It just makes me someone who finally woke up to his own prejudices at 57 years old after destroying his career and harming countless people. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said. I can't give you what you lost, Hayes continued. I can't undo the humiliation. I can't make people forget the incident when they Google you. I can't take away your nightmares or anxiety. I destroyed that possibility when I let my biases dictate my actions. He paused. The only thing I can offer is the truth. I was wrong. Not just in judgment, but fundamentally wrong in how I viewed and treated people of color. I'm trying to be better, but that doesn't mean you should forgive me or that I deserve redemption. It just means I'm trying. Ada studied his face. Looking for insincerity, for self-pity, for the defensiveness she'd seen in his televised interview a year ago. She didn't see those things. She saw genuine shame and regret. Whether that translated to actual change, she couldn't know. I'm not going to forgive you, Ada said flatly. Not because I'm holding a grudge, but because forgiveness would require trust, and I don't trust that you've fundamentally changed. People don't undo decades of bias in 1 year. Hayes nodded. I understand. But I will say this. If your growth is genuine, if you're actually examining your prejudices and working to be better, that's good. Not for me. For the people you interact with now. For those students you teach. They deserve better than the person you were. They do, Hayes agreed quietly. The conversation continued for another hour. Painful. Honest. Without reconciliation or neat resolution. When it ended, Ada stood. Hayes stood as well. I hope you continue the work you're doing, Ada said. Not because you deserve redemption, but because those kids deserve good teachers who see their potential. Thank you for meeting with me, Hayes said. I know you didn't have to. Ada walked out without responding. Some things didn't require a response. When the documentary aired 3 months later, the confrontation between Ada and Hayes generated intense discussion. Some viewers were moved by Hayes's apparent remorse. Others were angry he'd been given a platform at all. Ada was praised for her strength and criticized for agreeing to the meeting. She'd expected both reactions and ignored them. Because the same week the documentary aired, NASA announced something far more important. Ada had been promoted to principal engineer for the Europa Clipper mission. She'd lead the team designing the spacecraft that would explore Jupiter's icy moon. This was what she'd worked her entire career for. A chance to help answer one of humanity's biggest questions. Could life exist in Europa's subsurface ocean? Hayes watched the documentary from his apartment. He saw himself on screen. Saw the pain on Ada's face as she described the lasting impact. When they announced her promotion at the end, he felt genuine happiness for her. Followed immediately by shame that his discrimination could have derailed someone so brilliant. He sent no message. Made no contact. He'd learned that much at least. Some things weren't about him. Ada's success was one of them. 2 years after the incident, Ada stood in an airport terminal. Not LAX, but Houston's George Bush Intercontinental. She was heading home to California after a successful week of mission planning for Europa Clipper. As she walked toward her gate, she found herself on the same concourse where everything had happened 2 years ago. She stopped at gate 47. The very spot where Captain Hayes had blocked her path. She stood there for a moment, remembering. The humiliation. The anger. The fear that she'd miss her critical meetings. The feeling of being made small in front of strangers who did nothing. But also what came after. The changes. The conversations. The young women inspired to push forward. Dr. Mitchell. Ada turned. A young black woman in a pilot's uniform approached, her face bright with recognition. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "But I had to say something. I'm Kennedy Williams. I just completed my first month as a commercial pilot with this airline." Ada smiled. "Congratulations. That's wonderful. I wanted you to know that I applied to flight school after seeing what happened to you 2 years ago," Kennedy continued. "I was working a retail job, thinking piloting was impossible for someone like me. But when I saw you refuse to stay silent, when I saw you land that Mars rover, I thought, if she can do the impossible, maybe I can too." Ada felt her throat tighten. "How's it going so far?" Kennedy's expression became more serious. "Honestly? It's hard. I get passengers who are surprised to see a black woman in the cockpit. I had one guy ask if I was really qualified to fly the plane. My training captain makes comments sometimes that he probably doesn't even realize are racist." "Do you report them?" "Every time. Because you taught me that silence protects the system." They talked for 10 more minutes. Kennedy described her goals, her challenges, her determination. Ada listened and offered advice, contact information for mentors, encouragement. When Kennedy left to catch her own flight, Ada felt something shift. Her legacy wouldn't just be the spacecraft she helped design or the missions she led. It would also be the doors she'd opened for people like Kennedy. She walked to her own gate. First-class boarding was called. She approached without hesitation. The captain stood at the jetway entrance greeting passengers. He was a black man around her age with salt and pepper hair and smile lines around his eyes. His name tag read Captain James Wilson. He saw Ada and his smile widened with genuine respect. "Dr. Mitchell. I heard you were on my flight today. It's an honor." "Thank you, Captain Wilson. I read your book. The chapter on orbital mechanics was brilliant. My daughter's studying aerospace engineering at Howard. You're her hero." They chatted briefly before Ada boarded. No questions about her ticket. No scrutiny of her credentials. Just professional respect from one expert to another. Ada settled into seat 2A. First class, as she'd earned. As she deserved. She pulled out her laptop and opened files for the Europa mission. The passenger next to her, a white businessman, glanced over. Working on something interesting? Trajectory calculations for a mission to Jupiter's moon, Ada replied. Wow. That sounds complicated. It is. But that's what makes it fun. He smiled and returned to his own work. No questions about whether she really knew what she was doing. No surprise that she was qualified. Just acceptance of her expertise. The plane took off smoothly. Ada worked on her calculations, lost in the elegant mathematics of orbital mechanics. Planning how to send a spacecraft on a 2.6 billion-mile journey to a moon covered in ice that might hide an ocean harboring life. This was who she was. Dar. Ada Mitchell. Senior aerospace engineer. Mission leader. Mentor. Barrier breaker. The discrimination incident was part of her story, but it didn't define her story. It was one chapter, not the whole book. When the plane landed in Los Angeles 6 hours later, Ada gathered her belongings and deplaned without incident. Captain Wilson stood at the exit thanking passengers. Safe travels, Dr. Mitchell, he said warmly. Thank you, Captain. Excellent flight. She walked through LAX, past gate 47 one more time. She didn't stop this time. That moment was behind her. The future was ahead. That evening, Ada sat in her office at JPL surrounded by monitors displaying Europa's icy surface. New data from telescopic observations had just come in. Her team would analyze it tomorrow, looking for signs of water plumes that might contain organic molecules. She thought about the journey from that humiliating morning 2 years ago to this moment. The pain and the progress. The setbacks and the victories. Her phone buzzed. A message from Kennedy Williams. Just finished my first solo flight as captain. Thank you for showing me this was possible. Ada smiled and typed back. You did this yourself. I just refused to be silent. You chose to be brave. She looked at the images of Europa on her screen. Somewhere under that ice might be the answer to humanity's oldest question. Are we alone? And Ada would help find out. Not despite the discrimination she'd faced, but having survived it and fought back and inspired others to do the same. The universe was vast. Her place in exploring it was secure. No pilot, no prejudice, no barrier could take that away. She was exactly where she belonged. So now I want to hear from you. What part of Ada's story resonated with you most? Have you ever faced discrimination and fought back? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and justice prevailing over prejudice. And remember, excellence is the best response to discrimination. Ada didn't just fight back with words. She fought back by being brilliant, by refusing to be made small, by opening doors for those who came after her. Thank you for watching this story. May you always have the courage to stand up for what's right, the strength to pursue excellence despite obstacles, and the grace to lift others as you rise. Until next time, keep reaching for the stars. Ada's story teaches us that discrimination thrives in silence but crumbles under accountability. When Captain Hayes questioned her right to board based on appearance alone, he represented a systemic problem far bigger than one prejudiced pilot. His 20-year pattern of targeting passengers of color revealed how unchecked bias becomes institutional discrimination. The most powerful lesson is that excellence doesn't exempt you from prejudice, but it does give you a platform to fight back. Ada's NASA credentials didn't prevent discrimination, but they amplified her voice when she refused to stay silent. Her decision to speak up, despite exhaustion and humiliation, sparked industry-wide changes that protected countless others. We learn that true accountability requires more than apologies. It demands systemic reform, transparent reporting, meaningful consequences, and ongoing vigilance. The airline industry's response, from mandatory bias training to tracking discrimination patterns, shows what's possible when organizations face public pressure to change. Perhaps most importantly, Ada's mentorship of young women demonstrates that our response to injustice can either perpetuate cycles of harm or break them. By channeling her pain into purpose, she transformed her experience from a moment of victimization into a movement for change. Her legacy isn't just the spacecraft she designs, but the doors she opens for those who follow. What would you have done in Ada's situation? Would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe discrimination has no place in our society, show your support by hitting that like button right now. Have you or someone you know experienced similar treatment? Your story matters, so share it in the comments to let others know they're not alone. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss stories of courage standing up to injustice. Share this video with friends, family, and co-workers who need to understand why representation and accountability matter. Every share helps spread awareness and creates conversations that lead to real change. Thank you for taking the time to watch Ada's story. May you always have the courage to challenge discrimination when you see it, the strength to support those who face prejudice, and the wisdom to recognize that we all have a role in creating a more just and equitable world. Remember, silence protects the system, but your voice can change it. Until next time, stand strong, speak up, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in spaces you've earned the right to occupy.